The Titanic was a British ship registered in Liverpool, England, and it was operated by the shipping company White Star Line. The ship was the second of White Star Line's 3 Olympic-class ocean liners, the other 2 being the RMS Olympic and the HMHS Britannic. Titanic was owned by J.P. Morgan, the same J.P. Morgan who founded what would become America's largest bank, and he was due to sail on board, but cancelled at the last minute. The Titanic set sail on her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York on April 10, 1912, but it would be her first and last sailing. The ship hit an iceberg and sank in the early hours of April 15th, just 2 days before it was due to arrive in New York. Of the estimated 2,240 passengers, more than 1,500 died, and most of them were third-class passengers. Titanic had 885 crew members on board, with 699 of them coming from Southampton. The crew did not fare well during the sinking, and 688, or 77% of the total crew, died. There were 2 crew members on board Titanic with dark histories, William Mintram and George McGuff. Both of them were convicted killers. If you're enjoying this video, then please consider subscribing to Hell is Empty. 94% of you devils are not subscribed yet. William Mintram was born in Southampton, Hampshire, England on February 10, 1866. His parents, William Mintram, a labourer, and Adelaide Elizabeth Light, both hailed from Hampshire. His brothers and sisters were Anne, George, Rosina, Emma, Alice, and Rosetta. In the 1871 census, William and his family were recorded as residing at 15 Threefield Lane, St Mary, Southampton. Later, they settled in the impoverished King Street area of St Mary's, where William would grow up. Here, William got into trouble numerous times. On September 30th, 1882, the teenage William assaulted a man named George Barton at the Victory Inn on East Street, for which he was sentenced to 1 month's hard labour at Winchester. He also faced other charges related to drunkenness and assaulting a police officer. At the age of 18, William married 17-year-old Eliza May Rose Veal in the summer of 1886. Their daughter, Rosina, was born less than a year later. Fast forward 15 years, and British census records in 1901 show that William and Eliza now have 5 children and live at 63 Winton Street in Southampton. William had been working as a ship's fireman for White Star Line in Southampton for many years, and his employer described him as having a good character. But in 1902, shortly after Eliza turned 34, William was charged with her murder. After work one night, William came home, and according to his son William Jr., his mother was sitting in a chair when his father slapped her across the face. He then took a knife and stabbed Eliza in the back. An article in the Times dated 24th of November 1902 said, "The prisoner, William Mintram, gave evidence and stated that his wife kept nagging him when he complained of the boy's boots being pawned by her for drink. He had a good deal to drink, and his wife rushed at him, and he remembers nothing more." William Mintram was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years in prison with hard labour. At the time, a conviction of murder would have brought a mandatory punishment of death by hanging, and so it's possible that the jury was reluctant to convict him for murder, as that would make the 5 children orphans. William ended up serving just 3 years. After being released from prison, his son, William Mintram Jr., who witnessed his mother's murder, emigrated to Canada, where he was later joined by his brothers. The eldest daughter, Rosina, just like her mother, married a ship's fireman called Walter Hurst. Walter and his father also worked for White Star Line. In 1912, the year the Titanic set sail, William Mintram was living next door to his daughter Rosina in Chapel Road, Southampton. It seems odd that Rosina would want to be in contact with her father after he murdered her mother, but she was. All 3 men, William Mintram, Walter Hurst, and his father Charles Hurst, were aboard the Titanic. William was working as a stoker on board, putting coals into the fires. It was one of the worst positions on board, working tirelessly in the heat right at the bottom of the ship. We have no account of what happened to William Mintram, other than that he perished. but according to family law, Charles Hurst grabbed a block of ice that had fallen on deck and threw it into Walter's bunk. He said, "Wake up, Wally, we've hit an iceberg." Charles Hurst and William Mintram died that night, but Walter Hurst, who jumped into the water about 5 minutes before the Titanic sunk completely, was pulled into a lifeboat. Rosina luckily had her husband return home, but her father, William Mintram, who killed his wife, did not. Had he been convicted of murder, he would have died by hanging, but he managed to live another 10 years and instead died on the Titanic. George Francis McGuff was born in Duncannon, County Wexford in Ireland on July 14, 1875. In the British census in 1901, 25-year-old George Francis McGuff was listed as serving time at HM Prison in Winchester. George was a mariner, and he was aboard the ship called the Rustington, which on March 10, 1900, was anchored off Santos in Brazil. George got himself into a drunken brawl with another member of the ship's crew, a Welshman named John Dwyer. The fight was witnessed by 4 other crew who said that George attacked Dwyer first and Dwyer just defended himself. During the fight, George allegedly pushed or hit Dwyer and he fell more than 20 feet down a hatch, landing on his head. He was found bleeding from his ears, eyes, and nose. Needless to say, he died. He was survived by his wife and 7 children. When George was told what he had done, he said, "I have done it like a man, and I can swing for it like a man." George was formally discharged and sent back to England to stand trial. Witnesses said that several crew members had got drunk while on shore, but when George got back on ship, he wanted to fight everybody. But the judge said there was no evidence of murder, and in the end, George was convicted of manslaughter on the high seas and sentenced to 15 months hard labour. The South Wales Echo on Tuesday, July 3, 1900, reported, McGuff, who was intoxicated after being ashore, wanted to fight and fastened on Dwyer, whom he butted in the stomach and, as alleged, threw him over the hatchway into the hold 20 feet deep, causing death. The defence was that the affair was accidental. After his short time in HM Prison, Winchester, George McGuff returned to working at sea. He also married a woman named Beatrice Nellie Ganaway, who was 10 years younger than him. But his crimes wouldn't end with manslaughter. George McGuff also assaulted his own 12-year-old niece, Lily Beatrice Harper. She was his wife's niece, and therefore his by marriage. The charge read as follows. He unlawfully and indecently did assault and ill-treat one Lily Harper on the 2nd of August 1910. On October 13, 1910, George was sentenced to 3 months of hard labour for this crime. In 1912, at the age of 36, George and Beatrice were living at St George Street in Southampton when George signed on to work as an able seaman aboard the Titanic. There were 29 able seamen on the Titanic, and they carried out day-to-day operations. They were also in charge of operating the lifeboat davits, which were mechanisms that lowered the lifeboats, and also manning the lifeboats. Unfortunately, 8 seamen died when they went down to E-deck to open the gangway and were never seen again. On the night of the sinking, George McGuff helped lower Lifeboat 14 and then possibly manned Lifeboat 9 along with other crew. He was assigned Lifeboat 9, but it's not clear if he actually left on that boat. Regardless, he left the Titanic on a lifeboat and survived. In the Irish Independent dated April 30th, 1912, George McGuff is quoted as saying, "When I left the Titanic, she was down to below the forecastle. I saw her back break, and I heard an explosion, either of her main steam pipe or of the boilers. I last saw Mr. Murdoch, the first officer, when he was lowering number 15 boat and keeping back some Italians. I distinctly saw the lights of another ship. I saw Captain Smith at some distance swimming towards another boat. When they reached out to help him, he shouted back, 'Look after yourselves, men, don't mind me, God bless you.' Then he threw up his hand and disappeared." After the sinking, George returned to England and for several years continued his career as a seaman travelling all over the world. He and Beatrice did not have children, but in 1920, at the age of 45, George did father a child with the teenage Agnes Fanny Harper. She was his niece and the sister of Lily Harper, who he had previously assaulted. After Titanic, George spent the rest of his life at sea. He was listed as a crew member on the ship Corbis, which sailed from Tampico, Mexico, and arrived in New York on November 24, 1924. But his name was struck out, and a note next to it read, "Deserted, Lisbon, October 19, 1924. He died at a hospital in Wanstead, London, on 6th of May, 1940. A notable woman on the Titanic was actress and socialite Dorothy Gibson. She was born Dorothy Winifred Brown on May 17, 1889 in Hoboken, New Jersey. Her father died when she was 3, and her mother remarried a man named Gibson. Between 1906 and 1911, Dorothy was a singer and dancer in a number of theatrical productions, including a 1907 Broadway musical called The Dairymaids. In 1909, Dorothy turned to modeling and began posing for famous commercial artist Harrison Fisher. Dorothy's image appeared regularly on posters, postcards, various merchandising products, and in book illustrations over the next 3 years. Fisher also often chose her likeness for several covers of best-selling magazines such as Cosmopolitan, Ladies' Home Journal, and the Saturday Evening Post. Dorothy made her debut in the film industry in early 1911. She began her journey as an extra but secured the position of leading lady with the newly established US branch of Eclair Studios. Dorothy swiftly captured the hearts of audiences, emerging as one of the pioneering actresses to be hailed as a star. Her performances garnered widespread acclaim, with her natural and nuanced acting style earning particular praise. Notably, her comedic talent shone in popular one-reelers like Miss Masquerader and Love Finds a Way, all filmed in Fort Lee, New Jersey, the epicenter of the American film industry at the time. In 1911, Dorothy began an affair with married silent film pioneer Jules Brulator. He was one of the most powerful people in film and was a producer at Eclair Studios, backing a number of Dorothy's projects. But Jules was married, and even though Dorothy was showered with gifts and affection, she wanted more. She and her mother hatched a plan to go to Europe and make Jules miss her so much that he would divorce his wife and marry her instead. Surprisingly, it worked. On April 8, 1912, while 22-year-old Dorothy and her mother were in Italy, Dorothy received a telegram from the studios telling her to come back to New Jersey right away. They had a production they wanted her to star in, and it couldn't wait. Dorothy knew the message meant Jules wanted to see her, so she booked the first Atlantic crossing she could find, which happened to be on a ship called Titanic. In 2 days, Dorothy and her mother got themselves to Cherbourg in France, where they boarded Titanic as first-class passengers. On the evening of the sinking, Dorothy was playing bridge with 2 men in the first-class saloon. The ship hit an iceberg at 11:40 p.m, and although she and her group felt it, they didn't think much of it at first. The players wanted to finish the game, so they continued. But eventually, she noticed something was off. Staff were walking quickly and nervously. After leaving the saloon to investigate the noise, Dorothy saw water flooding the deck and noticed the ship was listing. Immediately, she knew they were in danger, so she went back inside to fetch her mother and companions. No one else in the saloon seemed to notice the ship was starting to lean to one side. They made their way on deck, and by now a nervous crowd had gathered. People were pushing and shouting, and although she wasn't sure where to go, she found herself being pushed towards the lifeboats. Dorothy and her mother got into the first lifeboat to be launched, Lifeboat 7, and although men were supposed to step back and allow women and children to get in, Dorothy insisted that her male companions be allowed into the lifeboat as well. The lifeboat had a capacity of 65 people, but unfortunately, when the lifeboat launched, it only had 28 people, 25 first-class passengers and 3 crew. They took a vote and decided not to go back for more people. Upon seeing the ship sink, Dorothy said she heard a terrible cry that rang out from people who were thrown into the sea and others who were afraid for their loved ones. But Dorothy didn't care that much about the people dying in front of her. Instead, she thought of her car that she would never drive again, and all the luxury clothes that she bought to seduce Jules that she would never wear. She even said these thoughts out loud so other people would hear. While Dorothy's comedic roles were popular among fans, her most famous role was playing herself in Saved from the Titanic, a film about her own experience surviving the sinking. The film was obviously a money grab from her studio that wanted to capitalize on her survival. Jules Brulator, instead of considering implications for Dorothy's well-being, helped finance the film and encouraged her to do it. He told her she would become more famous and receive a big payday. So just days after being rescued, Dorothy would relive and reenact the night of the sinking. It was a short, silent film, only 10 minutes long, and Dorothy not only starred in it, but she wore the same clothes she was rescued in. But a reporter suspected that Dorothy was not in her right mind while filming. He said she cried on set and was clearly traumatized, noting that she had the appearance of one whose nerves had been greatly shocked. The film was released internationally 1 month after Titanic's sinking, but the film ended up being lost with its only prints destroyed in a fire. It also happened to be Dorothy's last film, supposedly having been too traumatized to continue acting. According to a report in the Harrisburg Leader, she had practically lost her reason by virtue of the terrible strain she had been under to graphically portray her part. At this point, Jules was planning to divorce his wife. One night, Dorothy was making the regular drive from her Manhattan apartment to Jules's Long Island house when, for an unknown reason, she ended up on the sidewalk. She crashed into a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. She left Mrs. Smith with serious injuries, and unfortunately, Mr. Smith died. Mrs. Smith sued Dorothy for her husband's death, but Dorothy used a fake name to avoid damaging her reputation. During the following court case, she was referred to as Dora Gibson. During questioning, Dorothy lied and said that she and Jules were just friends, but she was caught out when questioned if she was also friends with his wife. She said she wasn't, which raised suspicions. Why would she be friends for years with the husband and not the wife? But then it was revealed in court that the car she was driving was Jules's. If that wasn't enough, Jules testified that Dora was his fiancée. So the press knew at this point that Jules was engaged to a woman named Dora Gibson, even though he was already married. But Dorothy mistakenly outed herself when she testified that since surviving the Titanic, she had been nervous to drive. After mentioning the Titanic, the press jumped on all of these details, and it was obvious that Jules Brulator had been having an affair with actress Dorothy Gibson. It was quite the scandal. But even worse, the world knew that she had killed a man. Dorothy Gibson lost the case and had to pay Mrs. Smith $4,500. Subsequently, Jules's wife, Clara, was embarrassed that her name was brought up in this mess. She divorced Jules, and he was forced to pay her a large sum of money. In 1917, Jules and Dorothy were finally married. It was what they had wanted for so long, but it didn't last. They both cheated on each other. It's doubtful they loved each other and instead just loved the thrill of secret relationships. They got divorced, and Jules had to pay Dorothy $10,000 a year in alimony. He moved on quickly though, and remarried yet again, this time to another actress 8 years younger than Dorothy. Since they shared many of the same friends, Dorothy was embarrassed that he found a much younger woman, and so she decided to disappear. Dorothy took her alimony and moved to Paris, where she had more affairs with more married men. When World War II hit, she and her mother moved to Italy. Dorothy's mother was half German, and the two of them developed a loyalty to the country. They became Nazi sympathizers until 1944, when Dorothy renounced her involvement. She was arrested for being an anti-fascist agitator, but managed to escape prison. At the end of the war in 1946, she and her mother moved back to Paris, and Dorothy died of a stroke at the age of 56. Her mother died 15 years later. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like and consider subscribing for more true crime videos.